Slow Path to Peace, Book 2 in the Sunburned Land series, written by Juliette Duncan, narrated by Sarah Kennedy.
Chapters 21 to 30.
Chapter 21. Maggie stood with her hands on her hips. Serena wasn't on the veranda. In the past week, she had been glued to the old cane rocking chair on the veranda, doing nothing other than staring into the distance. She hadn't been reading. She hadn't been talking. She just sat and stared, and it grieved Maggie greatly. That was why she'd brought her book with her. She needed to do something while she sat with Serena, especially since she wasn't talking. But now she wasn't here. She must be in her room. That was the most obvious place to look. Maggie headed back to the main entrance and walked quietly down the hallway, pausing outside the guest room where Serena was staying. She knocked softly and called out. No answer. She knocked again, this time a little louder, but there was still no answer. She opened the door just enough to see that Serena wasn't there. It was strange, but somehow promising, since it meant she was doing something other than sitting or sleeping. But where could she be? Perhaps Janella would know. The aroma of freshly baked bread wafted from the kitchen, so Maggie headed in that direction. As she poked her head around the corner, she half expected to see Serena sitting on a stool, but only Janella and Sasha were there. Hey Maggie, come in, Janella said with a friendly smile on her round face. I've just made coffee, would you like one? Well, that's kind of you, but I'm actually looking for Serena. Have you seen her? She's not on the veranda or in her room. Janella's smile widened. Yes, she came and grabbed an apple a while ago and said she was going for a walk. You could have knocked me over with a feather. Maggie sat on a stool, almost in a daze. I don't believe it. I didn't either, but there was something different about her. She seemed to have more spirit. I'm thinking she's turned a corner. Tears pricked Maggie's eyes as hope filled her heart. That would be wonderful if it's true. Janella nodded. Yes, it would. Now let me get you that coffee. Thank you. I think I need it now. Maggie smiled as she dabbed her eyes and silently thanked God for the encouragement she so desperately needed. Serena had chosen the path that led into the bushland in preference to the one that led to the lagoon and log cabin, or the one that led to the workshops and open grazing land, figuring no one would be in the bush since everyone was working. She needed time to think about what she would do. After Frank's challenge, she felt the need to take action, but she didn't know what that should be. Although the idea of staying at Goddard Downs appealed, would she be hiding from the world if she did? It would be easy. She'd settle into a routine of sorts, and she'd never have to see anyone other than those who lived there. And they'd all been kind to her. Too kind. Just like David. She let out a deep sigh as she slowed her pace and gazed around. The bushland was peaceful, even with the sound of cicadas and the occasional caw from a crow breaking the silence. But what would staying achieve? This wasn't her home. Her home was in Darwin, where her friends were, where her job was. But could she return and expect everything to be the same? People would stare. She wouldn't be able to walk down the street or go for a coffee without people turning from her repulsed. It had already happened. She'd noticed the looks, the glances, the turning away when her scarf had slipped. The thought crossed her mind that she could wear a hijab like the Muslim women did, but she quickly cast that thought aside. Although she'd let her Christian faith slip, wearing a hijab would be hypocritical and inappropriate. As she walked, twigs broke beneath her feet and she took extra care not to trip. Finally, reaching the edge of the bushland, a majestic vista opened before her. In the distance, shimmering in a heat haze, were the ancient rock formations and dark, jagged outlines of the Miramar Ranges. In between, savanna plains stretched to the left and right as far as the eye could see. Her gaze caught on a white-tailed eagle soaring over the plains, and once again she thought how wonderful it would be to have wings to fly far away. But she was jumping from thought to feeling like a child playing hopscotch on the playground. The question she had to answer was whether she wanted to live in isolation or if she wanted to rise above what others thought and regain at least some semblance of her previous life. Silence wrapped itself around her and brought a little calmness to her soul as she took in the magical vista. Easing herself onto a rock, she took the apple from her pocket. Biting through the skin into the sweet flesh made her think of that verse she'd recalled that morning. Deep down, she knew it didn't matter what she looked like. But would she ever be brave enough to face the world and not let it worry her? And what about what was going on inside her? The way she'd treated David. Since arriving in Paris to be by her side, he'd gone above and beyond to care for her. It might have been partly out of guilt, but he hadn't deserved to be treated with a cold shoulder and snide remarks. And now he was gone. After the words she'd said to him, she doubted he'd ever want to see her again. Despite everything she'd said, that thought filled her with deep sadness and a longing to be held by him. It had been her who'd stopped their relationship from progressing. She hadn't wanted to be tied down. But perhaps she'd been wrong. Not all relationships ended badly. David was nothing like her father. He was kind, caring, considerate, and handsome. But he was needy. And that's what she didn't like. She didn't like needy. It would never work while he was needy. All the same, she hoped he'd stay safe while fighting those fires. He'd been a hero on several previous occasions when battling huge fire fronts. He'd even been commended for his efforts. But it was guilt that drove him. She sensed he wouldn't let go until he lost his life saving another. And that was stupid. What use was a dead firefighter? She finished her apple and stood. No, she needed to forget about him. As she strolled back along the track, she made her decision. Chapter 22. After helping Janella with the lunch preparation, Maggie was setting the table when Serena walked in. Like Janella had said, there was something different about her. Her head was held a little higher, her shoulders set a little squarer, her back a little straighter. Maggie paused what she was doing and smiled. "How was your walk, sweetheart?" Serena rubbed the back of her neck and rolled her shoulders. It was okay. Maggie held her gaze. She knew her daughter and sensed she was holding something back. Perhaps she didn't want to talk in front of Janella. She lowered her voice. "Would you like to chat?" Serena nodded. "Let's go outside." She turned to Janella and said they'd be back soon, and then slipped her arm around Serena's waist and walked with her out the door and onto the veranda. A bank of thick, dark clouds was rapidly approaching from the east, accompanied by rumbles of thunder. The afternoon storm was coming early today. Maggie prayed Frank and the boys would find shelter and stay safe, although not many of the recent storms had been violent, and they mostly didn't last long, just long enough to cool the air for a short while. "Well, looks like you made it back just in time." She nodded towards the cloud bank. "Yes, I didn't see it coming." Maggie sat on a recliner. "Like what happened with the blast?" "Yes. I didn't see that coming either." Maggie squeezed Serena's hand. "I wish I could wave a magic wand and change it back to how it was before. It's okay, Mum. Somehow I'll survive. I'm slowly coming to terms with it, although I doubt I'll ever get used to this." She raised her hand to her cheek and winced. "But I have to live with it. I don't have a choice." "It's going to take time, sweetheart." "So, have you decided what you'll do?" "I have. As much as I like it here and everybody has been kind and accommodating, I'm going to go back to Darwin. If I stay, I'll only be treading water." "I thought you might decide that." Maggie drew a breath. "Frank and I will go with you." "I want to go on my own." Serena spoke with quiet firmness in her voice. "Oh, but I'll be fine, Mum. I know you only want to help, but I need to find my own way." When do you want to go?" "As soon as I can." "Oh." Maggie gulped. You won't stay and go on the cattle drive? No, I thought about it, but I want to go home. Surely you need someone with you now that David's not there. I can look after myself. I can get to my doctor's appointments, I can go shopping, I can do pretty much everything I need to do. But won't you be lonely? I have friends. Of course you do. And besides, I need to find out who I am. I can't do that if I'm with people 24/7. Maggie was about to say they'd give her plenty of space. She still had her own apartment in Darwin after all, but she sensed she'd already said enough. Instead, she drew a slow breath and said, I can understand that. After your father left, I went through much the same type of thing. Everyone thought I needed to be busy to get my mind off him. But what I actually needed was time to process it all and find out who I was when I wasn't Mrs. Cliff Donovan. So yes, I can understand how you feel. But during that time, I also discovered that talking with others who'd been through a similar experience and come out the other side was helpful. There aren't many people who've been through this. Serena raised a hand to her cheek again. No, but there are probably more than you think. Turia Pitt, for one. Turia, a beautiful young woman, had suffered catastrophic burns when she and several other competitors in an ultra-marathon race had been trapped by a fire in a gorge not far from Goddard Downs several years earlier. Now she was a motivational speaker and an inspiration to many. I doubt she'd speak with me. You never know, she might, but I'm sure you'll find someone in Darwin either way. I guess I could ask at the burns unit. That's probably a good idea. In fact, they might even have a support group. I'm not sure I want that. Maggie shrugged. There's no harm in finding out. I guess not. But anyway, I'd like to leave as soon as possible. When do you think that could happen? Well, Frank and I are flying to Kununurra tomorrow afternoon. You can come with us. Serena's face brightened. That'd be great. I'll check the flights to Darwin. I think there's only one a day and it's in the morning, so you might need to stay overnight. We were planning on staying with Frank's sister and brother-in-law. I'm sure you'd be welcome. Well, if that's the only option, I guess I'll take it. Why are you going to town? Anything special? Maggie nodded. We're going to church on Sunday morning. Wow, that's a big effort just to go to church. I know, but I've been missing the fellowship. We're going to go as often as we can. Neither spoke again for a few moments before Serena said, Why do you think God allowed this to happen to me? Tears welled in her eyes. Maggie shifted closer and squeezed her hand while her heart broke for her daughter. I don't know, sweetheart, but I'm sure He's got something good planned for you. I'm not sure about that. We're not on speaking terms at the moment. Maggie knew that, and it grieved her. But she had hope that one day soon that would change. Perhaps not, but His arms are open wide, waiting for you to step into them. Serena shrugged her shoulders as if she were shrugging the words away. Maggie wasn't sure why Serena had walked away from her faith. She guessed it was the pull of the world, but she knew that God wouldn't give up on her. He'd keep knocking on the door of her heart until she let Him in. He was relentless in His love for His children. And although He didn't cause it, He could use her scarring and a life stripped bare to grab her attention. There were worse things in life than a scarred face, like an eternity spent without Him. Sometimes it took the loss of things that were considered important to realise they held no importance at all. Janella poked her head around the corner, glancing between the two of them. Sorry to interrupt, but lunch is ready if you'd like to join us. Maggie smiled. Thanks, we'll be there in a jiffy. Janella gave a nod and disappeared inside. So, will you break the news about leaving now or later? Maggie asked. Well, since I've made up my mind, I may as well tell them now. As long as you're sure. I am. And Mum, don't worry about me, I'll be okay. Maggie reached out and squeezed her hand again. I know you will, sweetheart. You're a strong girl, but don't be so strong you isolate yourself from everyone. There's real benefit in community. I know. I just need time to get there. Okay. Well, how about giving me a hug? Maggie stood and held her arms out. Serena rose and walked into them. Thanks for being such a wonderful mum. I love you. Her voice hitched. Tears pricked Maggie's eyes as she gently hugged her daughter. I love you too, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you. But now let's go and get lunch before we both burst into tears. Serena sniffed. Good idea. That bread of Janella's smells so good. I know. I'll have to learn how to bake it. You bake bread? I'd like to see that. Maggie hooked her arm through Serena's as they headed inside. And just what are you saying? Serena chuckled. Nothing. Oh, yes you are. I can cook. Sure you can. Serena! I'm only joking, Mum. You're a great cook. Serena gave her a wink. Maggie couldn't help herself. She chuckled along with Serena and it felt good. Almost like old times when neither had a care in the world. The storm broke as they sat down to lunch. A simple affair, roast beef salad served with crusty bread. Serena broke her news not long after Olivia gave thanks and they'd all begun eating. After she told them, Olivia said she'd be sorry to see her go. You'll be welcome here at any time, Janella added. Thanks. Serena smiled gratefully at the two women. I've really appreciated your hospitality. It's a great place, but I need to go home. A little later, while they were drinking coffee, Maggie broached the other topics she'd discussed with Frank the night before. She offered her help with the eco-tents, which was gladly accepted, and she also mentioned the possible get-together with the other cattle station owners in the area. We used to do that once or twice a year when Mum was alive, Olivia said, a wistful tone to her voice. They were a lot of fun, Janella added. Did you always have them here? Maggie asked. Cradling her coffee mug, Janella leaned back in her chair. Mostly, but sometimes we'd go to the other stations. Everyone camped out overnight. We'd have a barbecue followed by a bonfire, and people often stayed up chatting all night. It's a pity we stopped having them, Olivia added. Do you think it's a good idea to start again? Maggie asked. I'm willing to help if you do. I think it would be good, Olivia said. Especially now when all the stations are struggling because of the live export ban. It'd be good to connect and support each other. Great, Maggie smiled, leaning forward. Where do we start? You're really eager, aren't you? Janella chuckled. Maggie cringed. She hadn't meant to be quite so enthusiastic. Oh, I'm sorry. I guess I'm just trying to feel my way. It's fine, Olivia said, reaching out and gently squeezing her hand. We'll look at the calendar and come up with a few dates, and then we'll call around and send out the invitations. Oh, I didn't mean for you to do all the work. Janella chuckled again. Don't worry, we won't. We'll leave you to organise everything else. Okay. Maggie swallowed hard. She hadn't quite expected that. I'm joking, Maggie, Janella said. We can do it together. Relief flooded through her. She wouldn't mind doing it all, but not having been to a gathering like this before, she'd flounder if she had to do the first one all on her own. After a little more discussion, Maggie helped with the dishes and then had a quiet word with Serena. Would you like to do some work in the vegetable garden with me this afternoon? Serena's brows arched. Vegetable garden? Yes, I offered to help Olivia with it. I know nothing about growing vegetables. I know you don't, sweetheart. All we'll be doing is pulling weeds. Ew. It's not that bad, although thanks to the storm it'll probably be muddy. I guess I don't have anything else to be doing. Great. Smiling, Maggie hooked her arm through Serena's and led her to the veggie patch. These snatched moments with her daughter were precious, especially with Serena's planned return to Darwin, and Maggie silently thanked God for them. At least she'd only be 1,000 kilometres away, not halfway around the world as she'd been on and off for the past few years. What do you think you'll do when you go back home? She asked as they walked along together. Serena shrugged. I don't know. To be honest, I feel at loose ends. That's why I need time to figure things out. They reached the veggie patch and Maggie opened the gate, motioning for Serena to go in first. Wow, this is huge. I had no idea it was here. They grow enough vegetables to feed the entire family, Maggie said proudly. I guess I should have explored the property more instead of feeling sorry for myself and doing nothing. Maggie bit her lip. She couldn't agree more, but didn't want to say so. Perhaps the next time you come to visit, we can take you on a full tour, including an overnight cattle drive. When Serena grinned, Maggie's heart warmed. I'm sure that could be arranged, she said, smiling. Great. I'll hold you to that. Serena surveyed the garden. So, where do we start? I was working in the bean patch this morning but didn't get a lot done, so we should continue there. Best put these on. She tossed Serena a pair of gardening gloves. She caught them and held them up. Ew, they're dirty. What did you expect? Vegetables grow in soil. Maybe I should watch. What if I pick up an infection? Maggie grimaced. How had she overlooked that? Serena's wounds were largely healed, but she still needed to take care. I'm sorry, Serena, I didn't think about that risk. It's okay. It's just how it is. How about we walk to the lagoon instead? The weeds aren't going anywhere. That sounds better. And then we could have a game of chess. I reckon I could beat you now. You really think so? Maggie headed out the gate, followed by Serena. Serena nodded. David and I have been playing a lot since we got back from Paris. Maggie's brow lifted. Had Serena forgotten that she and David were no longer a couple? It certainly sounded that way. But then her daughter's eyes clouded. I should have said we were playing a lot. We're not now, obviously. No. So, do you think you'll get back together? Serena shrugged. Unlikely. He's too needy. That can change. I'm not so sure. Since the day he showed up in the hospital in Paris, he smothered me. It was way too much and I couldn't handle it. Did you talk to him about it? She nodded. He doesn't see that he is. He's probably worried about you, that's all. You don't know, do you? Maggie frowned. Know what? About the fire when he was young. No. Maggie's brows scrunched. Serena blew out a breath. Let me tell you. I'm all ears. Maggie was gobsmacked. She'd always known David had a story, but had no idea he'd lost his mother and siblings in a fire. So, he's suffering survivor's guilt. Serena nodded. And that's why he takes so many risks when he's fighting fires. That makes sense now. I can't live with him like he is. He's obsessed. When he saw my burns, it was almost like a switch went off in him and his entire focus was on me. I can't handle that. Has he talked to anyone about his issues? Like a psychologist? Maggie nodded. I suggested he see one, but he wasn't interested. Maybe Frank can talk with David when he comes back. He's great at discussing things like that, even though he's not trained. If he comes back. Don't talk like that, sweetheart. Of course he will. You didn't see him when I broke it off. You're right, I didn't. Was he really angry? That's an understatement. Oh. They reached the cabin and Maggie suggested a cup of tea while they played chess. Sounds good. Serena smiled. Do you need a hand? Thanks, but why don't you walk to the lagoon while I make it? I might do that, thanks. Serena smiled again and took the path that led to the water. While Maggie waited for the kettle to boil, she watched her daughter through the window. So many emotions were flowing through her, but mostly joy. If she could have fixed Serena's scars, she would have, but that was impossible. Serena would need to learn to live with them, as she'd admitted. But Maggie also sensed a shifting in her daughter's heart, and that gave her hope. Lord, be with my precious girl. Help her to navigate her way through this and find her way back to you. Chapter 23. 2 mornings later, Serena sat in a small plane headed for Darwin. She was used to flying and had flown in aircraft of all sizes in her role as a reporter, but right now she felt queasy. Maybe it was simply because the flight was full and she was wedged between the window and an overweight Aboriginal woman. Whatever it was, her hands were clammy, her breaths were short, and her stomach churned. If the plane didn't take off very soon, she had no doubt she would vomit. "Are you all right, love?" the woman asked in a kindly voice. Serena nodded. "Just a little queasy, that's all." "First time in the air?" "No, I'm not sure what it is." Her scarf had slipped, and although her scarred cheek was on the side furthest from the woman, she adjusted it and pulled it tighter. "Maybe you're pregnant," the woman said brightly, as if being pregnant was something to be happy about. Serena shook her head vehemently. "I don't think so." "Oh well, if you want to swap seats, let me know." Serena offered a cursory smile. "Thank you." But it was too late to swap seats even if she wanted to. As the plane began taxiing down the runway and lifted into the air, Serena leaned back against the seat and closed her eyes. The nausea had eased a little, but the woman's words rang in her ears. "Maybe you're pregnant." No. The doctors had said her whole body had suffered a shock and that her menstrual cycle might take time to return to normal. Her missed periods were simply that. She wasn't pregnant. Couldn't be. Didn't want to be. But the possibility haunted her for the remainder of the 2-hour flight, and she found it almost impossible to steady her erratic pulse. What if she was? Maggie smiled at Frank as they walked into the small chapel behind Sarah and Michael, or Mick, as he'd insisted she call him. Last night, staying with Frank's sister and brother-in-law in their home, along with Serena, she'd seen a different side to this balding, slightly rotund, jolly man. On previous occasions when they'd briefly met, he'd been polite and reserved, but last night he'd been the perfect host. Maybe it was because Serena was with them. Maggie wasn't sure. But he'd been attentive and engaging as they sat outside on the veranda and chatted for hours while sipping cool drinks and enjoying Sarah's home-baked goodies. Even Serena had joined in, which surprised Maggie. Mick had been a long-distance truck driver before he retired and had many tales to tell. Like the time when he, along with 50 other truck drivers, had gotten together and transported 2,500 bales of hay 3,000 kilometres across the country to help farmers on the East Coast who were suffering in the drought. The story had brought tears to Maggie's eyes. Serena also shared a story of a similar kindness she'd reported on in England when a group of volunteers rode from Land's End in the south of England to John O'Groats in the north of Scotland to raise awareness and much-needed funds to build a shelter for the homeless in London's West End. To make her reporting more authentic, she'd ridden part of the way herself. Humbled by the generosity of the people she met, she'd been challenged to practice random acts of kindness since then. Maggie hadn't known that, but it made her proud. She was also glad she and Frank had made the effort to come to church. Her only regret was that Serena wasn't with them. Saying goodbye at the airport had been hard. Harder than expected. Her mother's heart wanted to wrap Serena in a big, warm hug and protect her from the world and assure her that everything would be all right. But she couldn't do that. Serena had to take responsibility for her life, make her own choices and decisions. But whatever path she took, Maggie would pray for her. Maybe it would take years for her to return to her faith. She hoped it would be sooner than that, but she wouldn't give up hope. Deep inside, Serena was a God-shaped vacuum waiting to be filled. Until she surrendered her life to him, she would never experience the true peace that came only from a right relationship with her Creator. As Maggie sat in the pew beside Frank and readied herself for worship, she sent up a prayer for her daughter. And then the service began. The congregation wasn't large. Less than 50 worshippers stood to sing the first hymn, amongst them a number of Aboriginals and Islanders who sang with gusto. Maggie envied those who could outwardly express their gratitude and heartfelt joy to God while worshipping. Having been raised in a more traditional church, and of course being married to Cliff for all those years, it had been frowned upon to display emotion in church. But sometimes she wished she could simply lose herself in the moment and feel free enough to raise her hands like some of those around her were doing. Maybe one day, but right now she closed her eyes and sang. God knew her heart, and she knew the words. Crown him with many crowns, the Lamb upon his throne. Hark, how the heavenly anthem drowns all music but its own. Awake, my soul, and sing of him who died for thee, and hail him as thy matchless King through all eternity. Crown him the Lord of life who triumphed o'er the grave, and rose victorious in the strife for those he came to save. His glories now we sing who died and rose on high, who died eternal life to bring and lives that death may die. Pastor Ned Thompson was an older man with greying hair and a salt and pepper stubbly beard. He welcomed everyone to the service and gave a special welcome to her and Frank, having officiated at their wedding. Maggie's cheeks warmed as everyone turned towards them and smiled. Frank squeezed her hand. He knew she was uncomfortable being the centre of attention, although that quickly changed as Pastor Ned gave the Bible reading from Romans chapter 8, verses 35 to 39. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? As it is written, for your sake we face death all day long. We are considered as sheep to be slaughtered. No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Jesus Christ our Lord. He looked up and paused before saying quietly, Will you pray with me? Bowing his head, he began, Our dear Lord and Heavenly Father, we humbly bow before you now with gratitude in our hearts for the assurance we have in you. Not one of us knows what tomorrow will bring, but as believers in an almighty God, we can join with Paul and state with assurance that we are more than conquerors whatever comes our way. Nothing can separate us from your love, dear Lord. Not famine, nor death, nor war, nor sickness. No, in all these things your love will sustain us, and we can face trials and tribulations with peace in our hearts. Help us to look up at all times, to trust in your unfailing love. And Lord, right now we pray for those suffering because of the fires down south. Many have lost their homes, some their loved ones. We pray that you will provide comfort, and that in this time of loss and heartache, many will seek you. Watch over our firefighters as they battle these dangerous fires. Keep them safe, dear Lord. In Jesus' precious name we pray. Amen. Maggie offered her own prayer for David before raising her head. Just that morning before they'd left, there'd been a news update advising that 2 firefighters had been badly injured and rushed to the hospital. No names had been mentioned, and she assumed David wasn't one of them, but she didn't know that for sure. Serena had refused to call him, but now Maggie felt the urge to at least send a message and let him know that she and Frank were praying. The pastor's message was relatively short, but to the point, as he expanded on the Bible passage he'd read, and by the time the service ended, Maggie felt uplifted and encouraged and determined to keep her eyes and focus on Jesus and to trust him with all aspects of her life. At the door, Pastor Ned greeted them warmly as he shook their hands. It's great to see you both. Looks like married life is suiting you. He grinned as his gaze shifted between them. Maggie glanced at Frank as he slipped his arm across her shoulders and gave her a squeeze. It sure is. Good service, by the way. I'm glad we came. Thank you. And I'm glad you did too. How's your daughter, Maggie? On a plane to Darwin as we speak. And her partner? Ex-partner? Fighting the fires down south. Oh. Let me know if you need any support. Maggie smiled. Thank you, I appreciate that. You're welcome. He smiled as he extended his hands to the couple following behind. They walked outside into the heat of the day. Sarah and Mick were waiting for them at the front of the church, but Mrs. Mary, Frank and Sarah's elderly mother, wasn't with them. Where's your mum? Maggie asked, looking around. Sarah chuckled. Chatting with her friends. We always have to wait for her. Maggie wasn't surprised. Mrs. Mary was a character and an inspiration to many, even at 91. "Did you want to get going or have you got time for a quick lunch?" Sarah asked. Maggie looked to Frank and shrugged. "What time do we need to leave?" "2-ish. I'd like to get home before the storm hits." He checked his watch. "It's only midday, so we've got time for lunch. How about we go out somewhere? Our treat." Sarah's face lit up. "That would be nice. I wouldn't mind trying that new cafe on Argyle Road." "Wivenhoe, you mean?" Mick said. "Yes, that's the one." "Sounds fine to me," Frank said. "All we need now is to find our mother." Sarah laughed. "I'll see if I can drag her away. I'll try not to be too long." Maggie stood beside Frank while they chatted. He and Mick began chatting, and she thought she might use the time to send a message to David. Not that he'd probably see it until later, since he was most likely in the thick of things, but he was on her mind. Just because he and Serena had broken up didn't mean she couldn't have any contact with him. She liked the man, and now that she knew about his past, she felt a greater need to help him, even if Serena didn't. She pulled out her phone and saw that Jeremy had called. She hadn't heard it ring because she'd had it on silent during the service. She thought it a strange time for him to call, since he would normally also be in church on a Sunday morning. Something must have happened. Immediate panic welled within her until she remembered the morning's message. "Lord, I'm sorry. Calm my spirit. I trust you, regardless of what may have happened. You're in control." But as she listened to the voice message, she felt the blood drain from her face. "Mum, Jeremy here. Calling to let you know that the girl passed away this morning and Dad's being charged with manslaughter. He's not doing too well. Will you pray for him?" She gripped Frank's arm. Although Cliff irritated her immensely and he'd only brought this on himself, she couldn't help but feel for him and for the girl's family. They'd all hoped and prayed she'd survive. Cliff would be a mess. He'd be facing jail for sure, and it would destroy him. "What's up, love?" Frank asked, his brows drawn together. "It's Cliff. The girl he hit died this morning." "Oh, that's terrible. Is there anything we should do?" She shook her head. "Jeremy left a message asking us to pray, but I think I should call him back." "Go ahead, take as long as you need." "Thanks." She stepped away and made the call. He answered on the first ring. Mum. His voice faltered. "Sorry, I'm just coming to grips with it." "It's okay," she said. "How's he doing?" "As you'd expect, he's a mess." "You're with him now?" "Yes." "Is he in custody?" "No, I'm at his apartment. He'll be facing court again tomorrow." Serena's on her way home, and in fact, she should be landing about now, although I doubt she'll be of any help, but she should know. Would you like me to tell her, or will you? "Oh, I'll call her. You don't need to do anything, Mum. He's not your problem anymore." "I know, but he shouldn't be yours either. You've got your own family to care for." "Oh, they're okay. Emma told me to do whatever I need to. She said I should stay with him to make sure he doesn't do anything stupid." "That will be fun for you." "Yep. The media are outside already." "Of course they are. What about Mandy? Have you spoken to her?" Mandy was Cliff's second wife, the one he'd had an affair with while still married to Maggie. "Yes, she doesn't want anything to do with him." "Well, that doesn't surprise me. Are you sure there's nothing I can do?" "Pray. The girl's parents are distraught, as you can imagine. It's a sad situation all round." "Are you okay, Jeremy?" "Yes, I'm trusting God will bring something good out of it." "Well, be assured of my prayers, and let me know if I can do anything to help you." "I will, and thank you." "You're welcome. Love you, Jer." "I love you too, Mum. Take care." "Thanks." Maggie ended the call and took a moment to compose herself before rejoining the others. Sarah had returned with Mrs. Mary, and the group of 4 stood quietly looking in her direction. She drew a slow breath, uttered a short, silent prayer for Cliff and Jeremy and walked towards them. Frank extended his hand, and when she took it, he squeezed it and looked deep into her eyes. "Are you okay, my love?" She nodded. "Yes, it was just a shock, that's all. Jeremy's okay. He's with Cliff now." "He's a good man," Frank said. "He is. I'm really proud of him. But I've held us up long enough. Let's go and have lunch, shall we?" "Are you sure you still want to go?" Sarah asked. "I can make a simple lunch at home if you'd prefer." "That's kind, but I think it would do us all good to go out." "So long as you're sure." "I am." "Well, we'd better get going. 2:00 will come around quickly," Sarah said. "Yes, it will." Maggie gave the best smile she could muster and walked with the group to the car, a Land Cruiser that seated 8. Mick helped Mrs. Mary into the front passenger seat, while Maggie joined Frank and Sarah in the back. She clung to Frank's hand and continued to pray for Jeremy and Cliff, the girls' family, and for Serena as she learnt the news about her father. And then she remembered she still hadn't sent David a text. She unlocked her phone again and began composing a message, but then deleted it and began afresh. "David, Maggie here. You've been on my mind and I wanted to let you know I'm praying for you. I hope you're winning the battle and that you're staying safe. Take care. Love, Maggie. XX." They arrived at the cafe moments after she hit send. It was a kilometre out of town and part of a farm. As Mick steered the car onto the property, she could see the alfresco seating under a shady canopy of mango trees. A young woman sat on a stool singing as she strummed her guitar, her voice melodious and somewhat comforting. It was a lovely atmosphere and helped Maggie take her mind off everything for a while, although every so often, an image of Cliff, Jeremy, Serena, or David flashed through it and her pulse skittered erratically. Each time, she uttered a silent prayer and reminded herself to turn her worries over to God. Peace flowed through her until the next image tried to snatch it away again. It was a constant battle, a war between trust and worry, faith and fear. But she needed to keep her eyes on Jesus because he had it all under his control, and she had no need to worry or fear. Chapter 24. When Serena turned her phone off flight mode after arriving at Darwin Airport, an alert telling her that Jeremy had called popped up. She thought it was strange. Although they were siblings, she and Jeremy weren't in touch often. They were too different. He and Emma were the sugary sweet, perfect couple who'd met at church, dated for 2 years, probably waited until they were married to be intimate, and then had children. They lived in the suburbs in a nice 4-bedroom home with a backyard, a pool, and a dog, and they went to church every Sunday. Everything she wasn't, nor aspired to be. She'd never wanted that kind of life. She loved her career and the buzz that came with it, travelling and living all over the world, reporting on events as they unfolded. And then, when she came home, which she did several times a year, David would be waiting and they'd pick up where they left off until she went away again. It suited her fine. All the benefits without the commitment. But that was over. She still didn't understand why he'd pressed her to marry him when he knew that's not what she wanted. But she didn't have time to dwell on that right now. She needed to find out what Jeremy wanted. He'd left a voice message, so wedging her phone between her ear and shoulder, she listened while she grabbed her bag from the luggage carousel. As she listened, a chill ran down her spine. Setting her bag on the floor, she quickly checked her newsfeed, and there it was, in black and white. 10-year-old hit-and-run victim Katie O'Rourke dies. Ex-politician Cliff Donovan charged with manslaughter. But the next headline grabbed her attention before she could thoroughly digest the first. New South Wales fires worsen amidst catastrophic conditions. A wave of nausea hit her. Forcing the bile in her throat down, she headed for a chair and took several deep breaths. This was crazy. Normally, she wouldn't have felt sick like this. The words spoken by the woman on the plane drifted through her mind, but she quickly sent them packing. She was not pregnant. It was simply the news that had made her feel nauseous. Manslaughter. Catastrophic conditions. Her head swam. And then she couldn't stop it. Vomit raced up her throat and exploded from her mouth like a spout and landed on the floor, splashing her sandals. Her chest heaved. No. No more. But too late. Another wave surged through her. As she leaned forward, someone, a man, handed her a paper bag. Here, use this. She grabbed the bag and vomited into it. Finally, she looked around. Everyone was giving her a wide berth. She didn't blame them. Who wanted to be near someone vomiting? To add to the humiliation, her scarf had slipped and her scarred cheek was in full view. She closed her eyes again and took some deep breaths. When she opened them, the woman from the plane was beside her, holding out a bottle of water. Taking it, Serena gave the best smile she could manage, and after wiping her mouth with a tissue, took a sip. The cool water was so good, balm to her raw throat. Thank you, she said. A male airport cleaner approached with a mop, a bucket, and a handful of paper towels. Are you sure you're not pregnant? The Aboriginal woman asked, her dark brown eyes soft but probing. No. Serena's reply was short and dismissive. She hadn't meant it to sound rude, so she quickly apologised. Sorry, I didn't mean to snap. It's okay, the woman said. Sometimes it takes a while to get used to the idea. I'm not pregnant. Serena spoke firmly, holding the woman's gaze until the cleaner, who looked Filipino, arrived. I'm sorry, Serena said to him, lifting her feet. It's my job. He handed Serena some paper towels. For your shoes. Thanks. She smiled and took the towels and after slipping her sandals off, wiped the mess from them. Instead of putting them back on, she opened her bag and grabbed another pair and wrapped the soiled ones in a towel before closing the bag. The Aboriginal woman sat quietly beside her. It was a little off-putting. What was she waiting for? For Serena to confide as to why the thought of being pregnant made her anxious. If she was, she'd be waiting a long time. After the cleaner left, Serena adjusted her scarf and stood. Thanks for the water, she said, giving the woman a short nod. You're most welcome, dear. Listen, if you ever want to talk, call me. She held out a business card. Serena's eyes narrowed, but she took the card and gave it a cursory glance. Then her brows lifted. Evelyn Gooding, Family Planning Counsellor. No wonder the woman's first thought was that she was pregnant. Thanks, but I doubt I'll need to. The woman patted her arm. Time will tell. Take care. She gave a warm smile and toddled off. Serena gazed after her. She was tempted to toss the card, but at the last moment tucked it into the back of her purse, in between a plethora of other useless cards. She'd clean it out one day, but not now. She needed to call Jeremy and find out what was happening with their father, and then she might send a text to David. She didn't want to talk with him, but catastrophic conditions didn't bode well, and although they'd broken up, she did still care about him. Knowing a wall of heat awaited her outside the terminal, she sought a quiet corner inside to make the call, but announcements were blasting over the loudspeaker every few seconds and she couldn't hear herself think. It was impossible. She gave up and headed outside. As expected, it was like walking into a furnace after being in air conditioning. It didn't help that it was the middle of the day with no breeze to speak of, and there were no clouds, so no imminent relief was in sight. She turned to the left and walked until the crowds were behind her. Stopping, she unlocked her phone and speed-dialed Jeremy. He answered almost immediately. Serena, I got the message. How is he? Not great. Her brother's voice was quiet, solemn. Where is he? I've brought him to our house to escape the media. Em's taken the kids to her auntie's. Do you want me to come over? Seeing her father was the last thing she wanted to do, but up to you. I'll be calling someone to take him away soon if he doesn't settle. Like, have him committed? She blinked. Yes. Is he really that bad? He's having a breakdown. She swallowed hard. I'll come straight away. Thank you, that would be great. I'll be there as quickly as I can. Ending the call, she hailed a cab and jumped in. Seated in the back as the taxi driver headed to Jeremy's house in the suburbs, memories of her childhood flitted through Serena's mind. Memories she'd rather not dig up if she were honest. Growing up, all her friends had thought her dad was wonderful. Cliff Donovan, family man, politician. They were so envious of her. But he was anything but a family man. He had no interest in what she and Jeremy were doing unless it suited him. He only watched them play sports so he could have his photo in the paper to be seen supporting them. When they got home, it was as if they didn't exist. She didn't know how her mum had put up with him for so long. When he was awarded Father of the Year when she was 12, she'd almost puked. He was the most two-faced person she knew. He'd only flown to Paris to be with her when she was in the hospital so it looked good to his constituents. He might have gotten her a better room and preferential treatment, but he was there for his benefit, not hers. He hadn't sat with her and held her hand like Mum and David had for days on end. Her shoulders fell. She'd meant to text David. Despite everything, she truly hoped he was okay, although she knew that he'd do anything to save another person's life, even if it put his at risk. Opening her phone, she started composing a message. I just heard about the conditions down there. Stay safe and don't do anything heroic, okay? She was about to say something about wanting him to come back in one piece, but thought twice about it, since he might misconstrue the meaning. She didn't want to give him hope, so she simply ended it, Serena. No kisses. The taxi pulled up outside Jeremy's house. She paid the driver and climbed out. Low set, cream brick, tidy garden. It was almost enough to make her puke again. Drawing a slow breath, she walked up the driveway and wondered what awaited her. Chapter 25. At the rate the fire was barreling towards the small town of Baltimore, David figured they had less than an hour to save it. It wasn't impossible, but it would be a big ask, a miracle. He hadn't seen too many of those this past week. What do you think? He shouted to Troy, his co-captain, as the fire truck bounced along the rough fire trail above the town. We'll give it our best. Like him, Troy had come from Darwin and was committed to saving as many properties and lives as possible. But he sometimes held back when David rushed in. Not every firefighter was as gung-ho as him. They didn't need to be. Good, he shouted back. 2 other trucks followed, and each truck carried 6 firefighters. 18 men against a wall of flame. They could do it. The air was thick with smoke, and an ominous glow of red headed their way. There was no escape for the people of this town. The wind had changed direction. The roads were impassable, and they were stuck. Anyone who hadn't heeded the call to leave was doomed unless the fire could be diverted. They reached the end of the trail and jumped out. The task was to set a fire and have it burn everything between the town and the wall of fire roaring towards it, so that when they met, with nothing left to burn, both fires would dissipate. It was a gamble. The wind change had slowed the fire but hadn't stopped it. With a mind of its own, this brute still consumed everything in its path and had already jumped containment lines, destroying property, livestock, and acres of farm and bushland. The fact it hadn't taken anyone's life was a miracle. But if they couldn't stop it now, there was no doubt it would cause casualties, possibly even their own. Troy barked instructions to the men who complied without question. There was no time to waste. Half were to douse the narrow line between the town and the ridge with water. The other half were to set and manage the backburn. The wind was too strong and unpredictable for retardant to be airdropped. The heat too intense for water to have much impact. They had to treat fire with fire. It was dangerous because the wind could change direction at any time. They all knew that. If it did, their only option would be to get out, quickly. David led the team setting the fire. He'd done this before and knew what he was doing. He was good at it. It was even said that he had a sixth sense. Maybe he wasn't sure. but he could read a fire as good as any, probably better. Everyone trusted his instincts, and he hoped they wouldn't let him down this time. The 9 men worked together as a team, clearing vegetation on the town side of the line before they poured accelerant from one end to the other. Standing between the 2 teams, Troy gave the nod. David's team was spread along the line, and on his word, the accelerant was lit and flames danced to life and took off. The extreme heat and tinder-dry conditions was all that was needed. The wind did the rest. The new fire whooshed and roared as it took off. They'd done all they could. But would it be enough? Could it stop the fire? With their job done, David and 3 of his team joined the others. The remaining 5 stayed to monitor the backburn and alert the others if it turned. Grabbing a fire hose, David began dousing the trees and undergrowth with water, but his thoughts were on the townfolk who'd stayed to protect their homes. No doubt they'd be out with their garden hoses frantically spraying them, hoping it would be enough, but they had no idea what was coming. They needed to find safety, not stand against a fire that didn't play by any rules. If it broke the containment line, a garden hose would be about as helpful as a kid's shovel in a snowstorm, and his 6th sense was telling him it was coming. It was only a matter of time. He and the men had been instructed to do everything in their power to stop the fire from reaching the town. But what if they couldn't? They needed to get the people to safety. There had to be somewhere they could go. As he called Troy on his handheld radio and peered through the swirling smoke, he sensed, rather than felt, the wind change. Looking over his shoulder, he froze. The fire was racing towards them. His heart pounded as adrenaline kicked in. They had to get out of there, and quick. But they had to warn the townfolk. They couldn't let them perish. "Troy, I'm going down." "Roger that, I'm right behind you." Large embers swirled in the ferocious wind as thick black smoke filled the air and cut visibility. The roar of the approaching fire was like a freight train as it hurtled closer. The edge of the township was a few 100 metres to the west. Could they outrun it? He didn't know, but he'd give it his best. It was difficult to run in his protective gear, but something ignited within him and drove him forward. Once, he tripped over a boulder and landed on his face. He scrambled to his feet and ran on as if a roaring lion were chasing him. The heat was intense and his throat was parched, but he pushed on and on. A house came into view through the smoke and relief flowed through him. He headed straight for the back door and thumped his fist on it. "Anybody here?" There was no reply. The occupants had either left early or were sheltering. He hurried around the side and then to the front. The house appeared empty. He left it and headed to the next one. The properties were on large lots and the next house was a good 100 metres away, surrounded by towering gum trees that would sizzle and ignite in an instant, sending fireballs into the house. Why people built so close to those trees was beyond him. Didn't they know that the oil in the leaves was highly combustible? He put those thoughts aside as he sprinted to the house. The back deck was on stilts, at least 20 metres above the ground, and the house was built into the side of the hill. The owners hadn't given much thought to what would happen if a fire roared up that hill, like it was now. This brute would consume everything in its path, including the house. Breathless as he reached it, through the smoke, he could just make out the shape of a man frantically spraying the house with water, yelling to someone inside. Panic had set in. David approached and called out. The man turned and peered at him, his eyes wide. He appeared to be in his 30s, although it was hard to tell. Whatever his age, he was about to lose his home, but he and his family would lose their lives if they didn't act swiftly. "How many are inside?" David shouted. "3, my wife and 2 kids. You've got to find shelter. You'll die out here. I need to save my house." "No, you need to save your lives. Put that down. Let's go." He placed his hand firmly on the man's back and directed him to the door. "Where are they?" he asked, pushing it open. "In the bathroom." "Have you got blankets?" "Yes." "Grab them while I run the bath. It's already full." "Even better." David gave the man a nod of encouragement. At least he'd observed some of the guidelines. He peered through the house to the expansive glass doors that opened onto the deck, which David assumed would normally give a panoramic view of the town and surrounding area. Right now, the view was a wall of smoke, thick, insidious smoke that could choke the life from a person in seconds. "Where's the bathroom?" "Down the hall to the left." "Grab the blankets and take them there." The man hurried off in the opposite direction while David headed down the hall to the bathroom and pushed the door open. A young woman sat on the floor cradling a newborn and a toddler. She looked up as he entered, her dark eyes round and filled with fear. He crouched down and spoke gently. "It's okay. I'll get you to safety." He prayed it wasn't an empty promise. The man joined them, his arms laden with blankets. "Put the blankets in the water. We need to saturate them." The man complied. Within moments, the blankets were sodden and heavy. David pulled one out and placed it over the woman and children. He then spoke to the man. "Put one over yourself and follow me. Hurry." He grabbed a blanket for himself and held his arms to the toddler. "I'll take him," he said to the woman. The toddler cried and clung to his mother. David addressed the man. "Pick him up." Although the man seemed to be in a trance, he did what David directed. David glanced outside. They had minutes, possibly less. "Do you have a water tank, a bunker of some kind?" The man nodded. "A tank, out the back." "Let's go." He ushered them out the back door. Although he was sweating, the howl of the fire racing up the hill sent chills down his spine. The man headed for the tank. It was a concrete one. David overtook the couple and instructed them to huddle on the far side of it. "Lie face down, cover yourselves with the blankets, and pray." He then threw himself on top of them. His heart thudded as the fire approached. Despite the saturated blanket, the heat was intensifying by the second. They were going to die. Gas bottles exploded, trees crackled and snapped, and a sickening thud told him that at least part of the house had collapsed. The fire was over them. The heat was unbearable, the smoke pungent. Hell couldn't be any worse than this. Darkness filled his eyes, and his world went blank. Chapter 26. Maggie pushed the plate containing the remains of her caramel tart aside and dabbed her mouth with a napkin. Although she'd enjoyed sharing lunch with Frank, Sarah, Mick and Mrs. Mary under the welcome shade of the mango tree, her thoughts were with Cliff, Jeremy, Serena and David. Not that Serena and David were together anymore, but she couldn't seem to separate the pair in her mind. Frank slipped his hand into hers under the table and squeezed it while asking if she was ready to leave. She nodded, although she'd rather be flying to Darwin than to Goddard Downs. She'd only said goodbye to Serena that morning, but things had changed already with the shocking news about Cliff. And Sarah had mentioned over lunch that she'd heard the conditions were worsening in New South Wales. Maggie had discreetly checked her newsfeed on her phone and discovered that her new sister-in-law was right. The conditions today were catastrophic with extreme temperatures and wind. The authorities expected several towns to be decimated unless the firefighters could gain the upper hand. David was one of those firefighters, and she knew he'd be in the front line. Not that she could do anything to change either of those situations, but she felt the need to be close to her family, to support them, to hug them. All she'd be able to do from Goddard Downs would be to talk with them and pray. Frank pushed his chair back and stood behind her, his hands gently massaging her shoulders as he said to the others, "It's time we headed off, sorry." "There's nothing to be sorry about," Sarah said. "It was lovely seeing you both. We're all finished anyway." She stood and helped Mrs. Mary from her seat, and then they all headed to the car. Mick dropped them to the private airport, and after hugs all round, Frank and Maggie walked across to the helicopter. Although she quite liked flying, she looked forward to the dry season when the roads would once again be open and they could enjoy a leisurely drive. They climbed aboard, and within moments, Frank received the all clear to take off, and soon they were airborne. Puffy white clouds broke up the blue of the sky, but much darker clouds were brewing on the horizon and were headed their way. They'd only just beaten the afternoon storm. "I'm not sure we'll get much sightseeing done today," Frank shouted through his headset, nodding in the direction of the clouds. Maggie shrugged. I think I'd rather go home anyway. He gave an understanding smile and squeezed her hand. We'll go another day. Yes. She returned his smile and then took in the breathtaking panorama. Savannah plains, framed by dark, jagged outlines of the ancient ridges and rock formations of the Kimberley, stretched out into the distance. Her eyes found a dirt road snaking through the plains and guessed it was the one leading to Goddard Downs. It stopped when it reached the flooded Ord River, but continued on the other side, about 100 metres across the brown, swirling water. Way too far to risk driving across. While writing Clara Goddard's biography, she'd learned that the early settlers in this remote part of the land had been almost totally isolated for up to 6 months each year during the wet season. At least she and Frank could fly. They landed at Goddard Downs half an hour later. Instead of going to the homestead, they headed straight for the cabin. Maggie wasn't sure if the family had heard about Cliff. If they hadn't, she wasn't in any hurry to inform them. But if they had, she didn't want to talk about him, at least until she'd spoken to Jeremy again. Once inside, she made a beeline for the kitchen and put the coffee machine on. As she turned to grab the milk, she collided with Frank. Oh, I thought you were upstairs. The bags can wait. I'll take them later. I thought you needed a hug. Tears pricked her eyes as he stepped closer and wrapped his arms around her. How did he always know what she needed? He was so unlike Cliff in every way, and yet it had been Cliff consuming her thoughts. She rested her head on Frank's chest and thought once again how blessed she was. Thank you. I did need a hug. Extracting herself from his embrace, she grinned as she planted a kiss on his lips. But now I need coffee. So coffee takes a higher priority than I do? He quirked a brow as he leaned back against the kitchen counter, crossing one ankle over the other and pinning her with his amused gaze. I didn't say that, she replied as she poured milk into the frother and turned it on. No, you didn't. And coffee sounds great. But what are we going to do after that? Completely understanding his meaning, she chuckled. Although in their 60s, they were newlyweds, and Frank was as virile and enthusiastic as a man half his age. I want to call Jeremy and find out how he's doing. Perhaps call Serena. But then, she angled her head and grinned. I could be persuaded to have a Sunday afternoon nap. I like the sound of that. I thought you might. She finished making the coffee and placed the 2 mugs on a tray with a couple of small pieces of apple and cinnamon bun Janella had made for them. Not that she needed anything more to eat. Frank offered to carry the tray. Where would you like to sit? Outside on the veranda? Sounds good to me. The storm's a little way off yet. Oh, I don't mind getting a bit wet. And besides, I like watching, as long as it's not too violent. It could be a doozy, looking at those clouds. He was right. They'd only just made it back in time. Black with a greenish tinge, the clouds blotted the sun out entirely and cast an eerie gloom over the lagoon. A clap of thunder sounded, making Maggie jump. Do you think we'll get hail? She asked as she sat on the chair. Possibly, Frank replied. The vegetable garden will get pummeled. Don't worry, the girls will have pulled the covers across, or if they haven't, they'll be doing it now. Oh, I should go and help. Maggie straightened and set her coffee mug down. He reached his hand out and stopped her. No need, love. The girls are more than capable. They do it every time we get a big storm. I know, she sighed. That was the problem. The girls were more than capable with everything. I told Olivia I'd do some work in the garden every day. I'm sure she'll appreciate that. I hope so. I'd like to lighten her load a bit, and Janella's too. You don't need to prove anything, Maggie. She knew she didn't, but she needed to be doing something to keep her mind active, especially with the recent events. I know, but I'm looking forward to helping. I know you are, and we'll start organising that get-together this week. She smiled. Great! The girls seemed excited when I mentioned it. I'm sure they did. It's been too long since we had a shindig. A shindig? She laughed. What are you thinking we'll be doing at it? Oh, maybe some dancing? I can boogie with the best of them, you know. Her laughter grew. She knew he could dance, but she'd never seen him boogie. What's gotten into you today? He put an arm around her shoulders and, pulling her close, kissed the side of her head. Being married to you has knocked 20 years off my life. You're such a smooth talker, Frank Goddard. He chuckled. Wait until you see me dance. She leaned against him as the storm approached. A huge gust of wind blasted across the lagoon, followed by heavy drops of rain that splashed onto the edge of the timber deck. She snuggled closer, feeling safe in his arms. It was cosy and dramatic all at once as the wind whipped through the trees and the rain grew heavier. Huddling in the corner of the veranda, the storm unfolded before them. It wasn't long before the hail started. Golf ball-sized pellets pummeled the ground and made a deafening racket on the roof. Just as quickly as it came, the storm disappeared and the sun broke through the clouds, bright and brilliant, making everything look fresh and clean. I hope the beans survived, Maggie said as she tucked a lock of stray hair behind her ear. Frank laughed. Is that all you can think about? No, they just popped into my mind, that's all. She set the mugs onto the tray and stood. I'll make those calls, and then maybe it's time for that nap. His face hitched with a grin. Great. I'll take the bags upstairs and unpack. I'll be ready and waiting. She bent down and kissed the top of his head. I'll try not to be too long. Reaching the kitchen, she quickly rinsed the mugs and placed them into the sink. She'd wash them properly later. Frank had said they should get a dishwasher, but she'd told him they didn't need one since it was only the two of them. She pulled out her phone and, perching on a stool, called Jeremy. It rang so long she was about to leave a voice message when he answered. Mum, sorry. It's okay, how are you doing? He blew out a breath and she imagined him raking his hand across his hair. Not so good. The doctor's here and so is Dad's lawyer. And Serena too, she turned up a while ago. I thought she might be there. I'm glad she's with you. But tell me, is your father worse? Yes, he's only just stopped pacing, and he's been muttering and yelling for hours. He's gone crazy, Mum. She could hear the despair in Jeremy's voice and it tore at her heart. Are you sure he's not putting it on? He hesitated before answering. I don't think he is, but who knows with Dad. I wouldn't put it past him. He'd do anything to stay out of jail, even feign madness. Well, the doctor seems to think it's genuine. I guess time will tell. What are they going to do? Admit him. Now? Yes. Oh dear. The thought of Cliff being admitted to a mental institution sent shivers up her spine. How is he handling that? It's like he's not aware. The doctor said they'll give him a sedative if he needs it. I guess this means he won't be in court tomorrow. That's right. It'll be delayed for sure. It makes me wonder. Serena thinks he's faking, but I'm not so sure. I really think he's having a breakdown. Are you okay, Jer? She asked, wishing she was there to support him. Yes, but it's tiring watching him pace for hours on end. You sound exhausted. Don't stay with him for long. I'm not allowed to go with him. He'll be placed in a secure ward with limited access. I wish I could be there for you. It's okay, Mum. Emma will come back once he's gone. Good. And what about Serena? Is she okay? Has she heard anything from David? She seems a bit anxious, but hasn't said much. I don't think she's heard from him. I'm praying he's all right. So am I. It's pretty bad down there. 2 firefighters are dead and 3 others are critical. It seems like a whole town got wiped out. She didn't know that. She hadn't checked her news feed since leaving the cafe. I hope he wasn't there. Me too. Oh, hey, I've got to go. The ambulance has arrived. Okay, I'll call back later. Take care, Jer. Love you. Tell Serena I'll call her soon as well. Will do. Love you, Mum. Maggie closed her phone and took a deep breath as a heavy weight settled in the pit of her stomach. It was senseless to worry, she knew that, but hearing about the firefighters had sent a chill through her bones. Even if David was safe, The two who'd died were someone's sons, someone's husbands, someone's brothers. And they'd given their lives willingly to save another. The ultimate sacrifice. And then there was Cliff, who'd taken a life yet was seemingly trying to avoid the penalty. Anger seethed through her. She shouldn't allow disgust for him to affect her. But he was Jeremy and Serena's father. And his actions affected them. And they were her children, and she cared deeply about them. They were involved even if she wasn't. What a mess he'd gotten himself into. Frank was waiting upstairs, but what she needed more than anything was comfort from the Lord. She flipped her phone open and found her Bible app. At times like these, reading through the Psalms helped soothe her spirit and helped remind her that God was in control. One of her favourites was Psalm 91, verses 1 and 2. She read the words slowly, silently, allowing them to calm her spirit. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust. Closing her phone, she bowed her head and prayed quietly. Lord, help my soul find rest in you. Let me focus on you and not on all the terrible things that are happening. Lord, speak to Cliff and challenge him. Use this situation to awaken his spirit, to change his heart. And be with David, Lord, I pray. I don't know where he is, or even if he's one of the firefighters who lost their lives. But Lord, I pray that he might be aware of your presence, and that will comfort him. Oh Lord, troubles are everywhere. Help me keep my eyes on Jesus, in whose name I pray. Amen. As she raised her head, her lips lifted in a smile. Frank had slipped onto the stool beside her so quietly she hadn't heard him. And he was now gazing at her with warm, understanding eyes. Are you okay, my love? He asked gently. Nodding, she reached for his hand. Chapter 27. Gasping, David sucked in a lungful of smoke-filled air. His head spun. His throat was raw. He tried to get up, but fell down. Blinked. The last thing he remembered, the fire was coming and he'd taken shelter. The family. Had they survived? His heart pounded. He'd never forgive himself if they hadn't. He heard the baby crying and relief flooded through him. They were alive, thank God. Covering his face with one hand, he helped the man and woman to sit. The man's eyes were round like marbles in his blackened face. Shell shock. The woman was the same. The toddler clung to the man, sobbing. Rocking back and forth, the woman tried to soothe the baby. We survived, David whispered. He coughed. How his throat hurt. They nodded, tears welling in their eyes. Thank you. Meters away, trees were burning and crackling as flames consumed the branches with an insatiable hunger. But they were safe. They were safe. David reached for his radio and called in. A rescue truck's on its way, the controller said after David explained where they were. Until then, stay put. We will. Thank you. He relayed the message to the couple. The man nodded and then scrambled to his feet, his eyes widening. The house? It's gone. His chest heaved as tears streamed down his cheeks. You can rebuild, David said. You and your family are alive. That's the main thing. The man wiped his face. But... Sit down, Stevie. He's right. We can rebuild. The woman reached a hand to her husband. In a daze, he nodded and sat. David had seen it all before, but it still wrenched at his heart. They didn't realise how fortunate they were to have survived. They could have easily died. Oh boy, did he know that. A house could be rebuilt. Lives couldn't. Once gone, they were gone. There was no coming back. The woman put her arm around the man and let him sob into her chest while she rocked him and the two children. A short while later, a vehicle lumbered up the hill and stopped near the tank. David stood and raised his hand to the two men who jumped out and hurried over to him, the burnt ground crunching under their boots. "Hey, how are you doing?" the older of the pair asked, his gaze travelling over David's body. "Are you hurt?" "I don't think so." "That's good to hear. And the family?" "They seem okay, although they're in shock." David nodded his head in their direction. "You were very lucky." He knew that. Did everyone else make it? When the man hesitated, David dreaded what he was about to hear. The man finally replied, 3 dead. 2 are fireys. 10 critical. Troy? Not sure, mate. They haven't released names. Let's get you out of here. He placed his hand gently on David's back and helped him into the truck, and then went back for the family. The makeshift triage tent was on the edge of the town's showground. The ground was charred and the grandstand in ruins. People, dazed, distraught and shocked, wandered aimlessly. Their town, including their homes, had been razed to the ground, and all that remained were charred memories. The family was attended to first. Apart from smoke inhalation, they were unharmed, and David was commended for his efforts. Others hadn't been quite so fortunate and had suffered burns and severe inhalation. Ambulances were lined up ready to transport the badly injured to the nearest hospital 20 kilometres away. After David had been checked and cleared, he began the search for his mates, his Darwin buddies. He found them sitting on the ground in a group, bruised, battered, exhausted, but alive. He sat beside Troy and put an arm around his shoulders. Nobody spoke. There were no words to convey how they felt. Sometime later, on the return trip to base, David checked his phone. There were 2 messages, one from Maggie and the other from Serena. Both brought tears to his eyes and made him want to go home. But he couldn't go. Not yet. The fires were blazing out of control and he had to help stop them. That was his job. He replied to each with a simple, "Thanks, I'm alive and okay." He had no energy to say anything else. That night, the dream that had plagued him for years became a nightmare. And he knew that when he returned to Darwin, he needed to find out the truth about the fire that killed his family. Serena received David's message as the ambulance left with her father to take him to the hospital. Tears pricked her eyes as relief flowed through her. She'd thought he was dead. Although names hadn't been released, she'd steeled herself for the news. Not that it would affect her, or so she'd told herself. But as live images of the fires had been played on the television, she knew that if he died, it would be her fault. How could she live with that on her conscience? Jeremy slid his arm across her shoulders as the ambulance disappeared around the corner. "Are you okay, sis?" he asked quietly. She shook her head and burst into tears. "No, I'm not." He wrapped her in his arms. "He'll survive. I don't know how, but somehow he'll survive." She nodded. She had no doubt that her father would survive. In fact, she had a sneaking suspicion he was faking the breakdown to avoid prison. "It's not Dad. It's David." Jeremy pulled back, his eyes wide. "He's not." She brushed her eyes and sniffed. "He's okay. He's alive." Jeremy expelled a heavy breath. "Oh, I thought for a moment you meant the opposite." "Sorry. I just got a message from him, that's all. It made me tear up." "You need to talk with him." She drew a long breath. "Maybe." He held her gaze for a good few seconds. "Okay, whatever. Now, do you want to stay or would you like me to drive you home?" "I think I'd like to go home, but I can get a cab." "I won't hear of it. I'll drop you home and then pick up Emma and the kids, unless you'd like to see them." Serena shook her head. "Not now, Jer. Maybe another time." Although they were totally different, she quite liked Emma and she loved Sebastian, and little Chloe was such a cute baby. But right now, being around them was the last thing she wanted to be. "Okay, come on, let's go." He clapped his hand on her shoulder and walked inside with her to grab her bags. After Jeremy left her outside her apartment block, she walked inside hesitantly. It had been weeks since she'd been there, and it felt strange to be there alone. David had obviously left in a hurry. Dirty plates were stacked in the sink and crumbs were on the counter. His cycling clothes were on the bathroom floor where he must have stripped them off before showering and dressing. The sight of them made her miss him. Perhaps she'd been too tough on him. She took her bags into the bedroom to unpack but stopped at the door. The bed was unmade and the room reeked of dirty socks and damp towels. Her stomach convulsed and she sprinted for the toilet, only just making it in time. After she finished vomiting, she stared at herself in the mirror. A glazed look of despair on her face. Maybe the woman was right. Maybe she was pregnant. She pressed her hand over her mouth to stop another wave of vomit. As the urge slowly subsided, she sunk to the floor, drawing her knees to her chin and encircling them with her arms. Tears stung her eyes and trickled down her cheeks. God, I know we're not on talking terms, but please don't let me be pregnant. Please. Chapter 28. The first few days back in the apartment, Serena was on a cleaning spree. She had to do something to take her mind off the possibility that she was pregnant. As she emptied cupboards, scrubbed floors, and sorted through old files, she desperately tried to convince herself she wasn't. But deep down she knew. And she had no idea what to do about it. If she told David, he'd expect them to get back together, but she wasn't ready for that. Since coming to be with her in Paris, he'd smothered her, treating her like an invalid who needed constant care and attention. She knew he loved her, but he'd changed. He'd always been caring, and she loved his adventurous spirit, but it was like a switch had flicked in him and he'd become so intense he hadn't left any room for her to be herself. What would he be like if she were pregnant? No, she couldn't tell him. Not yet. She needed time to figure it out on her own first. To do that, she needed to go outside and face the world. But the thought of going out scared her almost as much as the thought of being pregnant. But she needed to do it. Tomorrow, she'd go out. Since she'd returned from Paris, Danny, her manager from the broadcasting station, had been asking her to visit her colleagues at the studio. So far, she'd made excuses not to go. But tomorrow, she would. Having made that decision, she had an early dinner and went to bed exhausted, having worn herself out cleaning. The following morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered in through the blinds, Serena was tempted to stay in bed. What on earth had made her think it was a good idea to go out? She lifted her hand to her cheek as tears formed behind her eyes. There were so many things she'd never take for granted again. Smooth skin, for one. As well as her cheek, her left arm had damaged skin that would never return to normal. And her legs and chest also were scarred from the multiple surgeries she'd undergone. She hated the way she looked. And it was evident from the way people stared at her that they did too. How could she ever live normally again? Pulling the covers over her head, she squeezed her eyes shut and hid from the world. She wouldn't go out today. And maybe not tomorrow. Maybe the day after. But then her stomach convulsed. Throwing the covers off, she sprinted for the bathroom and once again only just made it. How could she be pregnant? Heaving into the bowl, tears mingling with vomit, she faced the reality that she was indeed carrying a child. Instead of climbing back into bed, she stepped into the shower and turned the heat up as much as her skin would allow. She took her time, allowing the warm water to wash away her tears and soothe her heart. Having children had never been one of her goals. She'd be a terrible mother. And besides, how could a child love her the way she looked? How could a child even look at me, period? There was only one way to be rid of a baby that she knew of. And although she prided herself in being a modern, progressive woman, she'd also been raised in the church and her conscience wouldn't allow her to abort a baby. Like it or not, unless there was some other reason for this sickness, She was going to have a child and needed to come to terms with it. She turned the water off and dried herself slowly. Normally, she avoided looking in the mirror, but today she stepped closer and studied her reflection. She didn't like what she saw. The face looking back wasn't hers. It belonged to some disfigured person she didn't recognize. The person's cheek was red and angry after the heat of the shower. The red would soon fade to a leathery brown, but it would never again look normal. She opened the jar of special moisturizing cream she'd been told to use and began massaging the cream into her skin. The doctor said it would help soften it, but she didn't believe him. Her cheek would never be soft again, but her face did feel better when she used it. Her hair was slowly starting to grow back, but it was hard to remember how sleek and smooth it used to be. David said he liked it short, but she didn't. He'd only told her that to make her feel better. Other than wearing a wig, there was little she could do except wait for it to grow back. Perhaps she could colour it. Maybe that would make her feel better. Child, I love you the way you are. No. Her jaw tightened. Nobody could love her this way. How could they? I do. I love you. Ignoring the stirrings in her heart, she turned from the mirror, quickly dressed in her yoga pants and a clean t-shirt, picked up her phone and made an appointment at the beauty salon down the road. 2 hours later, she emerged from the salon with pink highlights in her hair, polished nails and rejuvenated feet. The stylist, a young woman who hadn't seemed bothered at all by her scarring, had said the pink suited her and helped take the focus from her cheek. She'd also shown her some clever makeup tips that would also help. Glancing at her reflection in the window, Serena hardly recognised herself. Lifting her chin, she walked along the pavement, passing cafes and restaurants, fashion shops and florists, avoiding the stares of the people she passed. Although they probably didn't recognise her, most would have seen her on their television screens in the past. Serena Donovan, foreign correspondent for the NABC. But who was she now? That was the question she asked herself as she reached the waterfront. It was a lovely, warm day, and with her new hairstyle and makeup and the sun on her back, she felt a little more confident about the future. But then she remembered. Her future contained a baby. But she didn't know that for sure. Maybe she wasn't pregnant. She should find out. But she didn't want to. Finding out would make it real, and then she'd have to face the reality of it. No, she didn't want to know. Today she'd pretend she wasn't carrying a child. She'd go and visit Danny. But she couldn't go in her yoga pants and t-shirt, so she turned around and walked briskly back to the apartment and exchanged her casual wear for more appropriate clothing. Clothes she hadn't worn since before the blast. White linen pants, a bold pink shirt that matched her hair colour, and heels. A tiny smile tugged at her face as she appraised herself in the full-length mirror. Maybe Serena Donovan, foreign correspondent, could make a comeback. Her scarred cheek would be a constant reminder to her viewers of the sacrifice she'd made to bring them breaking news from around the world. Hope grew within her. Maybe she could have her old life back. The thought of it sent a warm glow through her. But then, just as quickly as it came, that hope was extinguished, replaced by a sense of despair. She could never have it back if she was pregnant. Trudging into the kitchen, she opened the fridge and grabbed a can of Coke, one of David's leftovers. The message he'd sent the other night had been brief, but at least she knew he was alive. She hadn't sent him another, but after easing herself onto a stool, she flicked through her newsfeed to see if there was any mention of him. And there was. The information was from 2 days ago, but there it was. David Kramer, firefighter from Darwin, hailed a hero after saving the life of a family in the southern New South Wales township of Barrymore. Of course he'd been hailed a hero. That was how he lived his life. All in, totally focused. He got up when he fell down. He never gave up. He pushed on. And yet he had given up. When she told him she would marry him, he'd walked out. Abandoned her. She hadn't expected that. Sipping the Coke, she pondered. Something had changed inside him, but she didn't know what. He'd always been hesitant to talk about his early childhood. She knew he'd lost his mother and 2 younger siblings in a house fire when he was 4. His father had survived but suffered a breakdown and became an alcoholic. And David had been taken in by his aunt and uncle who raised him as one of their own. She sensed his recent change of behaviour had something to do with memories of those early years. Perhaps her injuries had triggered something deep inside. Perhaps there was more to the fire than he'd told her. She was a journalist. Maybe she could do some digging. She could even start today. Finishing her drink, she slipped off the stool, grabbed her purse, and headed out with a spring to her step. She hailed a cab and gave the address of the station. It was lunchtime when she arrived. She hadn't planned it that way, but perhaps it was a good thing since there would be less people to ask her questions, to say how sorry they were. Outside the entrance to the 5-story modern building in downtown Darwin, she hesitated. Was she truly ready to face her colleagues? They'd been so kind and had sent numerous well wishes, cards, and flowers. But they had no real idea of what she'd been through. Seeing the pity in their eyes would bring tears to her own. As she lifted her hand to her cheek, her resolve slipped. Backing away from the door, she turned and ran headlong into Danny. "Serena! Is that you?" Her boss removed his tinted sunglasses, his gaze sweeping over her. In his late 40s, Daniel Coleman was dressed in faded jeans, a button-down shirt rolled to the elbows, and Nike slip-ons. He didn't look like the manager of a broadcasting station. "You look great." He leaned in and gave her a cautious hug. "Thanks." Giving him a small smile, she returned his hug. "Did I miss your visit?" She shook her head. "I changed my mind and didn't go up." "Serena, no one's going to stare at you. They'll love seeing you. How about I buy you some lunch and then we can go up together?" Before she could reply, he'd slipped his hand on her waist and pulled her out of the way of the throng of people who'd crossed the road when the lights changed. As the huddle passed by, she felt claustrophobic and sick. No, she couldn't be sick here. Not on the footpath. Not with all these people around. "I'm sorry, Danny, I need to go home." Her breaths became faster and she thought she was going to faint. "Serena, what's wrong?" She shook her head, almost unable to speak. "I feel sick." "Come inside and sit down." He pushed the door open and held it for her. She didn't want to go inside, but she did need to sit. He directed her to a plush armchair in the foyer and fetched a cup of water from the drinking fountain. By the time he returned, her breathing had calmed and her stomach had settled. She sipped the water gratefully. "Thank you," she said, offering him another small smile. "I'm not sure what brought that on." She lied. "It's probably because you've been hiding away for so long." "Yeah, that's probably it." She took another sip. "So, now that you feel better, let's grab a bite to eat and have a catch-up." She blew out a breath. She'd rather go home, but since she was here, she figured she may as well stay. "Sure," she said. "But can we go somewhere quiet?" "Whatever you want, my dear." He extended his hand to help her up. She didn't need help, but she took it anyway. It would be rude not to. "Where would you like to go?" he asked. She shrugged. "How about Arthur's?" Arthur's wasn't one of the restaurants frequented by the staff of the NABC, even though it was close by. She and colleagues favoured the newer restaurants and cafes at the marina, so they might avoid bumping into anyone she knew by going there. "Sure, Arthur's is fine. We can duck out the back way." She smiled at his understanding and walked alongside him, changing sides so her good cheek showed. If he noticed, he didn't say. "I'm sorry about your dad," he said once they were out of the building. He knew her father, although they weren't exactly friends, more acquaintances than anything. "Thanks," she replied. "I feel sorrier for the girl and her parents than I do for him, though. It's very sad. He should have known better than to be drunk driving." "Yes, and I think he's faking his breakdown." As soon as she said it, she wished she could retract her words. Danny was the last person she should have confided in. She turned and pleaded with him. "Please don't release that. I shouldn't have said it." He gave a lopsided grin. "And what do I get in return for withholding that piece of interesting information?" He was flirting, but somehow she didn't mind. Nothing, she said, playing along with him for a bit of fun. His shoulders fell and he looked crestfallen, but she knew he wasn't serious. Danny never took advantage of his position. That was one thing she liked about him. She gave a small chuckle. Come on, Danny, do the right thing. He winked. Of course I'll keep your secret, Serena. And tell me, how's David? A small breath flew from her lips. Why did the mere mention of David's name cause an ache in her heart? You might as well know. We broke up a few weeks ago. No way! It's true. She left it at that. Danny didn't need to know the details, although he'd raised a brow and was obviously curious. They reached the restaurant and he stood back, letting her enter first. They headed for the tables on the far side that ran alongside the wharf and had a great view across the harbour. After being seated by a waiter who left them with menus after filling their glasses with water, Danny asked what she'd like to eat. The thought of eating turned her stomach, but she had to get something. Nothing big. A salad sandwich will do. Lost your appetite? He lowered the menu and studied her over the top of it. She shrugged. I'm not that hungry. Okay, but I think I'll have the hamburger with the works. Her stomach seized and she pushed her chair back while covering her mouth with her hand, almost knocking the chair over in a hurry to stand. Excuse me. Without saying another word, she fled to the bathroom. Fortunately, no one else was inside. As she heaved into the toilet bowl, she wondered why she'd ever thought eating out was a good idea. After she cleaned herself up, she returned to the table. Sorry about that. He studied her intently. So, how are you really doing, Serena? She squirmed under his intense gaze. Direct questions weren't easy to answer, especially when asked by people who knew her well. And Danny did. She toyed with her glass of icy cold water. He was waiting for an answer. She drew a deep breath and lied, again. I'm doing okay. Really? He quirked a brow. Shrugging, she brushed a tear from her eye and looked away. No, not really. I know it's none of my business, but do you want to talk about it? Is it David? It wasn't any of his business, but all of a sudden she felt like confiding in someone who knew them both. She swung her gaze back to his, swallowing hard before she blurted out, He asked me to marry him and I said no. Oh. And now we're not talking and he's off fighting those fires. You're worried he won't come back? She nodded and briefly closed her eyes. She hadn't acknowledged that truth until now, but Danny was right. That's what worried her. That David wouldn't come back. That she'd driven him away and he might die. And that he'd never know about the baby. Their meals arrived and it took all her effort not to vomit again. So, what are your plans? Danny asked as he nibbled a chip. Will you come back to work? She took a deep breath. I don't know. It's too soon to decide. You need to be doing something. I know. I'm trying to figure out what. She took a tiny bite of her salad sandwich. I've got a job that might tempt you back. Her forehead creased. What's that? Host of the morning talkback show. Radio? He nodded as he bit into his hamburger, unsettling her stomach again. I'm not sure that's for me. You'd be great at it. It was something to think about, but being stuck in a broadcasting studio chatting with a bunch of self-opinionated listeners honestly didn't appeal. However, her options were limited. Nobody would seriously consider putting her back in front of a camera. I guess I couldn't have my old job back. She threw it out there as a test, although she already knew what the answer would be. Leaning back in his chair, he folded his arms and looked her in the eyes. Serena, I'm sorry. She held up her hand. It's okay, I get it. How long do I have to decide? A week? He leaned forward. I'm really sorry for what happened to you, Serena. Thanks. She pushed her unfinished sandwich aside and tried to quell her nausea. She was tempted to tell him about her suspected pregnancy, but decided he probably wasn't the right person to confide in, although she knew he'd take it in his stride. No, if she were to tell anyone, it would probably be Jeremy and Emma, although they had enough on their plate already. Maybe a better option would be that woman on the plane. Or her mum? Or David? No, not David. That made her remember what she wanted to ask Danny. Hey, can you do something for me? Sure, name it. Will you look into the archives and see what you can find out about a house fire that happened in 1989 in Nightcliff? 1989? Yes, it was the fire that killed David's mother and his 2 siblings. His forehead creased. What do you want to know about it? Toying with her glass, she gazed across the clear blue waters of Darwin Harbour. I'm not sure. I just feel that a stew of unwanted memories have been stirred up within David. She swung her gaze back to Danny. Since this happened, she lifted her hand to her cheek. He's behaved differently, like a switch flicked in him. He's having trouble sleeping and he's intense with everything he does. I think the answer lies with what really happened in that fire. Okay, I'll see what I can uncover. He smiled. He's a good guy, Serena. I wouldn't let him get away if I were you. Wow, I never thought I'd hear you say that. He shrugged. Neither did I. But to look after you the way he did, that was pretty special. And that's the problem. He didn't just look after me, he smothered me, like he was trying to justify living. Survivor's guilt and all that. Yes, but he's almost 35 years old. It happened a long time ago. Yeah, I guess there's that. Anyway, will you look into it for me? Sure, I'll do my best. Now, would you like coffee or shall we head back? Would you mind if I go home and come back another day? All of a sudden, I'm feeling really tired. No, that's fine. At least we've caught up. Thank you. Smiling, she pushed her chair back and stood. As they headed out, her phone beeped. She glanced at it while Danny paid the bill. It was a message from Jeremy asking if she'd like to visit their father with him. It was the last thing she felt like doing, but she figured she probably should. She quickly typed a reply and said she'd meet him at the hospital in half an hour. Outside the restaurant, Serena thanked Danny and promised she'd think about the job offer. He promised he'd look into the fire. They hugged, and then she jumped into a waiting taxi and gave the driver the name of the psychiatric hospital where her father was. Chapter 29. After Serena returned to Darwin, Maggie kept herself busy tending the vegetable patch and planning the shindig, as they'd all started calling it, not only to give her something to do, but to keep her from worrying. With Cliff in a psychiatric hospital, David in the midst of fires that weren't easing, and Serena back in Darwin on her own, she had to keep occupied, although prayers for all 3 were constantly on her lips and her heart. With the help of Frank and the girls, they'd made a list of neighbours to invite and had started making the calls. Well, she hadn't. Frank and the girls had. But she listened while they chatted and was growing excited about meeting their neighbours. So far, 3 families had said they could make it, while one, the Clermonts, said they weren't sure if they could leave their property for a whole weekend, but would try to get someone in to tend things. They had one more call to make to the folks at Brampton Downs where she and Frank had celebrated their wedding. Frank was making the call that evening after dinner. She'd baked his favourite meal of lasagna and was pulling it from the oven when her phone rang. She quickly set the hot dish on a trivet and answered. She already knew it was Serena from the ringtone. Serena, I was going to call you tonight. How are you doing? Maggie eased herself onto a stool and looked outside at the stunning sunset. I'm fine. But she didn't sound fine. Although her voice was upbeat, it held a slight hitch. Are you sure you're okay, sweetheart? Maggie asked. Yes, I had my hair coloured today. Oh, that's good. What colour? Pink. Maggie's eyes widened. Pink? The stylist suggested it. Oh, you'll have to send me a photo. Okay. A pause. I bumped into Danny today. He offered me a job. Really? That's great. I don't think I'll take it. What is the job? Radio talkback host. You don't sound keen about it. I'm not. You sound a little lost, sweetie. There was a long pause before Serena replied, and Maggie began wondering what had happened. Worry nibbled at her again, and her stomach began churning before she gave her worry to the Lord. I don't think I'm ready to go back to work yet. Maggie released a breath. That's all it was. I agree. It's probably too soon. There's no hurry to go back. She wanted to ask if Serena had spoken to David, but stopped herself. It was none of her business. How's Danny? She asked instead. Fine, same as usual. Maggie smiled. He's a nice man. Silence. Tell me, sweetheart, have you spoken to David? She couldn't help herself. No, Mum. We've broken up, remember? Ha ha, Maggie bit her lip. Sorry, yes, I do remember. I was wondering, that's all. I'm missing you, Serena. Maggie thought she heard a sob. Serena, are you okay? Yes, I've got to go, Mum. Good talking with you. And you. Take care, sweetheart. I will. When the call abruptly came to an end, Maggie remained deep in thought. There was something unusual in her daughter's tone. She couldn't put her finger on it, but something was wrong. She just knew it. Moments later, Frank's truck pulled up outside and he climbed out. She slipped off the stool and hurried to greet him. Even though she was keeping busy, the days seemed so long when he wasn't there. A smile lit up his face as she walked towards him. He held out his arms, slipping them around her as he kissed her on the lips. He smelled of hard work and manly sweat, but she didn't care. In the half-light, against a horizon of deep orange, her heart swelled with love. As she snuggled against him, her worries over Serena slipped away. For a moment. How's your day been, love? He asked as they walked arm in arm up the stairs. Interesting. Oh, what happened? He opened the door for her and then followed her in. I just had a call from Serena. She hasn't been herself for some time now, but I sense there's something more going on. He walked to the fridge and pulled out a jug of water. She has a lot to deal with right now. She leaned against the counter and folded her arms. Yes, between her depression and lack of confidence due to her injury, her father's problems, and David risking his life fighting those fires, her cup is full. You could call Jeremy. See if he knows if anything else has upset her since she got back to Darwin. Frank poured himself a large glass of water and drank it all in one go. She nodded. I might do that, but let's have dinner first. Good idea, I'm ravenous. She laughed. Just as well. I made enough lasagna for an army. He chuckled. Let me clean up first and I'll set the table. Outside or in? Outside? It's a lovely evening. She grabbed a knife and began slicing some tomatoes for the salad. It is. Outside sounds perfect. He came up behind her and slipped his arms around her and nuzzled her neck. Frank! Putting the knife down, she spun around and linked her arms around his neck. As his lips lowered to meet hers and she lost herself in his kiss, she decided that dinner could wait. Serena flopped onto the couch and closed her eyes. She was so tired, and although her body craved sleep, her mind wouldn't stop. It was spinning so hard it was almost out of control. After visiting their father in the hospital, she was coming to think that he was indeed losing his mind and he wasn't faking his breakdown. Seeing him huddling in a corner on the floor, muttering like a crazed person, had shaken her to the core. Although she didn't hold much respect for him, he was still her father, and it grieved her deeply to see him so troubled. Perhaps it was that depth of emotion that made her tell Jeremy about her suspected pregnancy. She hadn't meant to tell him. The words just poured out of her mouth as he drove her home. He'd been understandably shocked and was speechless for several moments before he told her she needed to find out for sure. He also said that Emma would go with her to the doctor in the morning. Serena had grimaced, said it wasn't necessary, but he insisted. You can't find out news like that on your own, sis. Trust me, you'll want someone with you. After he left, she felt the desperate need to be hugged by her mum. But her mum was 1,000 kilometres away. Instead, she rang her, and listening to her mother's voice made her a little calmer. Until her mum said she missed her. Then she broke down in tears and sobbed uncontrollably for half an hour. What was happening to her? She'd lived halfway around the world for months on end and had never been so emotional or needy. Squeezing her eyes shut, she tried to empty her mind, but the harder she tried, the more it spun. Finally, She swung her feet to the floor and turned the television on. She flicked through the channels, but as she stopped on a news channel that was giving a report on the fire situation down south, she realised it was a mistake. Her thoughts turned immediately to David. Deep down, she knew she'd hurt him. He'd been nothing but kind to her over the years, but she'd kept him dangling, saying she wasn't ready to settle down. But perhaps it was more that she was scared of love, of allowing herself to be vulnerable, of exposing her innermost thoughts to another. Maybe she had to take a risk and allow herself to be vulnerable. If she truly wanted peace and happiness ever again, maybe she needed to drop her guard. She picked up her phone and called him. Chapter 30. David was eating a late dinner after another long, hard day on the front. They were slowly winning the battle, but as soon as one front was controlled, another blaze flared up. It was constant and tiring, and he was bone-weary. He and his mates from Darwin had stuck together, and a deeper camaraderie had formed between them. Trust had grown and friendships had deepened. In particular, he'd gotten to know Troy Barrington better. They'd been workmates before, but now Troy had become his friend. It began one night when David was having one of his bad dreams. He'd woken in a lather of sweat to find Troy beside him, looking at him with concern. "Hey, Dave, what's going on?" he asked. Sitting, David cradled his head in his hands and fought back sobs. He didn't want to cry in front of his mate, but the images had been growing more vivid with each dream, and in this last one, he'd seen something that shocked him to the core. It couldn't be true. It just couldn't. "Come and have a drink," Troy said. David got up and followed him to the canteen. Troy grabbed 2 beers from the fridge and they headed outside. Except for the orange glow on the horizon, the sky was dark. The air was heavy with smoke, but he didn't smell it. It was normal now. They sat at a table with only the glow for light, while the wind whistled through the trees and he told Troy about his dreams. He wasn't sure why, but he felt the need to talk about them, and Troy was there. "I think I lit that fire," David said carefully. The very words tore at his heart, ripped it apart. "You don't know that for sure," Troy said. "Dreams are strange and usually don't make any sense. But it was so real. You were only 4. Seems impossible that you could have started a house fire." David drew a long breath and curled a hand behind his neck. "I know, but I need to find out." "And if you discover that you lit it?" David shrugged. "At least I'll know, and then maybe I can deal with it. I know only one way of dealing with things like this," Troy said. "Yeah, what's that?" "Prayer." "Prayer?" Troy nodded. "I believe in God. He knows our pain and our heartache, and he can reach deep within us, heal our memories and release us from guilt." "Can I pray for you?" It was the last thing David had expected, but somehow it felt right. So out there in the dark, with his heart exposed, he allowed Troy to pray for him. Tears welled in his eyes as Troy asked God to take the burden from him, to release him from guilt, to fill him with peace. They'd hugged and been firm friends since. The dreams hadn't stopped, but when he woke, he felt a little less burdened. When he got back to Darwin, he would discover the truth about that fire. And Troy said he'd help. His phone rang as he was finishing his dessert. He knew who it was from the ringtone. Serena. It had been days since he'd sent her a message. Because she hadn't replied, he'd convinced himself he'd never hear from her ever again. So now, his heart leapt. He pushed back his chair, excused himself, and walked away from the noisy canteen. Drawing a steadying breath, he accepted the call. "Hey, Serena, how are you doing?" "Not too good." Her voice was softer than usual and lacked the confidence she'd always exhibited. The results of the explosion were evidently still wreaking havoc on her life, and his heart went out to her. "What's wrong, babe?" She began sobbing. "Serena? I'm I'm sorry. He swallowed hard. It's okay. Whatever it was she was apologising for, it was okay. He didn't care. I love you. She sniffed. I love you too. I'm sorry for how I've treated you. He blinked tears. Her words were a balm to his weary soul. Oh, babe, there's nothing to forgive. You've been through so much. But it doesn't excuse my behaviour. Perhaps not, but what did it matter? They were on speaking terms again, and that's all he cared about. Where are you? Back home. Oh, I wish I could be there with you. She sniffed again. When will you be back? He gazed at the glow on the horizon and his shoulders fell. I'm not sure. The fires are still bad. Are you being careful? How did he answer that? He took calculated risks, but sometimes those risks put him in danger. That's what he did. That's what he'd always done. He did it to assuage his guilt, to justify living when his mother and siblings had died. And now it would be even worse if he discovered he was responsible for their deaths. But he couldn't tell her that. Instead, he replied, Of course I'm being careful. Good. I've got to go now, I'm sorry. I'll talk to you later. Okay, thanks for calling. I love you. But she'd disconnected the call and his misgivings about her mental state increased by the second. Something was amiss. He just didn't know what.
Slow Path to Peace continues in Volume 4, Chapters 31 to 40. Click the link below to keep listening.